that the OIE embraces on occasions and is arguably the most controversial aspect of the OIE. Foot and mouth disease zones in Brazil come to mind, where it's not as if you put up a fence, it's open grasslands and jungle and so on, and that zone doesn't have much credibility in cattle-producing nations around the world. South Africa seems to be floating a concept of a zone. Peter, what would be your approach to zones, and how much reliance do you really think we can place on them?
Peter, would
Another
you
question
like
to
to
me?
take that one?
Yeah. Peter, thank you. To Suzanne.
Thank you. Well, am I? Thank you very much for the question. It's a very complex question and really not easy to answer in 2 sentences. Because I think it's working. Thank you. Because there are different concepts here. The one you are referring to for foot and mouth disease is a concept of zoning that is not exactly the same as what I was describing when talking about equine disease-free zones. The concept for foot and mouth disease is based on a physical delineation of the part of your country that you want to declare free for one specific disease, in this case foot and mouth disease, following guidelines that are clearly outlined in the code. For the equine disease-free zone concept, you are looking at a number of equine infectious diseases, basically all the ones that are shown on the slides of the diseases that the OIE lists. And it's based on a temporary declaration of freedom to hold one event. At least this is how it has been applied so far. We have not, in this regard, really had discussions with South Africa because traditionally, as Peter also described, the Kenilworth quarantine was a proper zone like FMD, for African horse sickness. But because of the intrusion of African horse sickness into this zone, they lost the status. So please don't confound the 2 systems. The African horse sickness free zone in Kenilworth is comparable with the FMD free zone in certain countries. But the EDFZ concept for now is applied to an area that wants to host an event in a country that can as yet not fully declare its equine disease, its multiple disease terminology, health status. I hope I was clear.
Well, look, I think the fact is that from a South African perspective, when you look at African horse sickness, which is a vector-borne disease, I mean, there is no fence in the world which would stop a midge floating around the atmosphere. The reality is that South Africa's detected virus, and despite having controls and surveillance, the reality is that the consequence of detecting virus is a suspension in exports. What we are proposing is that a combination of 2 principles which exist within the OIE framework. One is that you can export from an infected country by providing continuous vector protection. And the second is to continue intensive surveillance so that at least we know what's happening outside of the environment. The reality is that vector-borne diseases pose a significant difficulty, and Africa and South Africa is infected with the disease, and that's not going to change.
Okay, do we have any other questions? Yes, Mark.
Hong Kong, Australia, everywhere else. A question to you, Brian. A lot of your talk was about horses going to Australia to compete temporarily in Australia. My question is the other way: Australian horses going out to compete in areas such as Hong Kong, Singapore, and so on. They're subjected to very rigorous quarantine to go back to Australia, yet they're moving into an area where there's substantial testing done. The health status of those horses is known. Probably that HHP group, select group, is sort of very active. But you seem to indicate in your summary that you don't see a lot of benefit for the HHP scenario going back into Australia. Would you have that same view for horses that are temporarily exported from Australia?
No, it's different circumstances, I think, Mark. I hadn't thought of that as a high performance, high health situation actually, and you're right, it is, and that may well be a good application for it. So, good point.
Brian,
Yes.
Steve Morris from Australia, if I could just quickly ask you, could you summarise what you feel the progress is in the relaxation of restrictions and how you would see it being, or what your view would be, should we be optimistic about further relaxation in the next 3 to 5 years?
I guess I spoke about the Australian situation. I think a lot of the benefits will probably come more from harmonisation and standardisation of how we go about things, so that things become more straightforward, clearer. Everybody understands what's required. That's important, and it's necessary. As far as Australia goes, I don't see any further relaxation or easier movement. I think we've reached about the point we can safely live with. I think a lot of the probably developed countries, that's fairly true as well. Interesting Mark's point about horses returning after international competition, and probably you can make a case that pre-export quarantine, post-arrival quarantine period could be relaxed somewhat, so that may make it easier for our horses travelling out and returning. Personally, I'm not optimistic that I could sell it to our government authorities at this stage, but it's certainly probably something we should be looking at. Places like Hong Kong already have very mature systems that work very well. I don't foresee that changing particularly. I probably do see potential for change more in developing countries that wish to become part of the international circuit and to develop their industries and participate in international competition, and that's going to happen through science, through monitoring, through understanding of the risks and quarantine, development of these zones. So I think there's significant potential there. I think the more mature countries have probably reached the limit of comfort at this stage, but there probably is benefit from harmonising our requirements, and I guess that's about the situation, Steph, yes.
Brian and Steve, Suzanne would like to add further comment to your question.
Very brief comment, just to say that the HHP concept, of course, takes full consideration of the special situation of equine influenza-free countries and makes provisions for it. I wouldn't dwell on the details because it's work in progress, and one of the most challenging part of the work in progress, as you can possibly imagine, but it's part and parcel of the concept to address these particular circumstances, as it is part and parcel of the concept to address the particular circumstances of Africa and African horse sickness situation. Thank you.
Okay, there's no further questions. I'll declare the session closed. So thank you very much, everybody.
When I said now for something different, I didn't think that Michael Lynch would say he gets pleasure in losing money at the races, but there you go. We have got some few minutes for questions. Matthew Cheung, both you and John Brumby talked about your appreciation of how racing does benefit the community. Do you think over time that will be understood more broadly on the Chinese mainland and across China more generally?
My own view certainly is this will be, Hong Kong will be a very successful model for mainland, particularly for mainland if it start off, It's a completely fresh exercise on mainland China. Hong Kong is a good model. As I said, it's a win-win recipe. Particularly, its non-profit making a business model provides integrity, and also, as Michael just said, that a consolation for those who lose money.
And John Brumby, you correctly identified these great events in Melbourne that kick in and help the community. The Australian Open Tennis, of course, the masterpieces, Michael wouldn't argue with that, the Spring Carnival, the AFL. What is the Grand Prix doing on the list?
Well, the Grand Prix is probably one of the mix of events, and I think the point I was making in my presentation is that the world in which we live, the world is sort of flat if you look at digital communication. So content is really important, and I think whether it's racing, whether it's arts, whether it's literature, people are after content, and racing provides content and theatre and activity and stories. And if you're putting together in a city a calendar of major events, then racing's a huge part of it, football's a huge part of it, and the Grand Prix's got its place. It's probably a different audience to the racing. It requires a higher level of subsidy, I think, than some other events, but it's got its place in that mix and mosaic of events that goes to make up the appeal, the lifestyle, the content, and part of the global reputation. And I repeat, for a city like Melbourne, we don't have a Great Barrier Reef, we don't have a Sydney Harbour. Being able to put on events that are then broadcast around the world is important. But in my mind, it's all about content, and that's why I thought, my comments and Michael's went well together, because livability, great institutions, great buildings, great architecture, but great content, racing, sport, arts, culture is what goes to make a great lifestyle. And if you've got a great lifestyle, like Melbourne, like Hong Kong, like London, like New York, you will attract the best people from around the world. So I think it's got its place, but it's not as big an earner as the Spring Racing Carnival.
Yeah. And on the integrity issue, and you did sound a gentle warning that they have to be ever mindful of the issues. You get the impression, though, with some sports that they tend to react to events as they happen, that they're not proactive enough. What would you say about racing?
Well, I'd say in our country that racing does pretty well. But I'm on a lot of boards, and the big thing for a board is focusing on your risks and how you manage those risks. And for racing, there are a number of events that might have a low probability of occurring, but they have a high or catastrophic impact if they do. And so I mentioned in my speech, getting integrity right is really fundamental. Getting governance right is really fundamental. Never underestimating the public trust that is placed in you by government and the citizens generally. Never being arrogant about that. But I think in Australia, we do those things pretty well. The respective boards and governments manage those risks and look to the future. But nothing's perfect. But I think we do it in Australia pretty well. And as I said, it may serve as a model that can be applied in other parts of the world, where by government fiat, racing's established, race days, legislation, wagering, all of those things, public trust, and then making sure you've got the model to properly share the benefits of that across the broader community, as they do so well here in Hong Kong.
And Alan, you raised such a range of issues, but I wonder whether I can pin you down and say that if you could change one big regulation, make one big change to the industry as it impacts on your industry, what would that be?
I think it's eventually the equalisation of the tax, the environments which the different operators operate in, and therefore allowing perhaps a more level contribution, more level and sustainable contribution to the industry going forward.
And given that TVN, Sky, does so much of the heavy lifting during the year, how frustrating is it when the Spring Carnival comes around and the big networks come in and they cherry pick the main races?
Oh, that's a specific industry decision to do so, because it's a balance between a segment that watches Sky, a segment that watches TVN, and a broader community interest in what are very big events. And I don't think you can deny that. And, I mean, it causes debate and what have we, but I think each channel has its role.
And Michael, just finally on racing in Hong Kong and your experience here. I was out at Sha Tin on Sunday, and it's a sort of religious zeal that you see in terms of how the punters approach the races. It seems that their minds are totally focused the whole time, and I don't think you can say that about the crowd at the Melbourne Cup, but it certainly seems to be the case here. But the other thing that struck me was the mounting yard and the amount of attention that goes on that. And when you've got such a facility with so many seats, a retractable roof, the concentration, have you been able to figure out what that's all about?
Well, I think alcohol is a good piece to take out of the equation. I think people are incredibly focused, but I also think that in a city where you are constrained for space and you're constrained for the outdoor experience, it does fulfil a lot of the things that in other places the performing arts or festivals might do. And so you do get this sense of intense focus over 5 hours, and that people really want to be absolutely aware of every activity, in the same way that if you go and see Wagner, they'll travel the world to see it. I've never seen a crowd that is more fundamentally focused on as much information, as much observation, as they can do. But at the same time, I think people have a lot of fun. It doesn't stop, the highs, lows, pain, suffering, that if you win or you lose. I'd have to say, I suppose the only other place that I was quite surprised by was Mexico City in the 70s. I went there racing for the first time, and I happened to be there with Peter O'Toole, the actor, and 6 gorgeous women that were travelling with him. And the crowd, it was the only, when he walked, Lawrence of Arabia walked into the stand, it created the hugest commotion. And I did feel, that Mexico City experience is like every week at both Happy Valley or Sha Tin.
Great stuff. Very entertaining session. Okay, time to take a break, and we'll see you back here at 10 to 4, but please thank the panel. Thank you. We'll now bring in the 3 other panellists at the far end of the lineup. James Gagliano from North America, the Chief Operating Officer of the Jockey Club, and before that he ran the operation in Maryland. As most of you would know, at the far end, Andrew Harding, who's Director of Racing here in Hong Kong, Secretary General of the Asian Racing Federation, and a former Chief Executive of the Australian Racing Board, and of course Paul Bitar, who is CEO of the British Horse Racing Authority. Now, just to get this part of the discussion started, I will draw your attention to a videotape. What you'll be looking at here is the Sunday Times chief sports reporter David Walsh, who uncovered the Lance Armstrong doping scandal. Here he's talking about lessons for horse racing and all of that. The interview was conducted in February. It was courtesy of Channel 4 Racing in France program Morning Line. We'll have a look at the video.
No man knows more about doping in sport than my guest this morning, David Walsh from the Sunday Times, a 4-time Sports Writer of the Year, garlanded heavily, of course, for his work on the Tour de France and particularly on Lance Armstrong. Great to have you with us here on the Morning Line, David. Has racing got a serious problem to worry about, in your opinion?
Yeah, I would say it has. I mean, there's been lots of murmurings within racing down through the years. I was at Gordon Park recently, and an old pal of mine who goes racing all the time, cornered me and said, this sport has a problem, you should be looking at it. Now, my feeling about racing is, and I've discussed this with officials, I say, you don't test horses that are deemed out of training if they've got an injury. And I said, but isn't that the logical time that you might build a horse back up with performance-enhancing drugs? Anabolic steroids are really good at rebuilding muscle. So if a horse is injured, it's a time you would seriously, want to be testing him. Similarly, I've had this feeling about yearlings. Yearlings are not deemed to be in training, therefore they're not tested. Now, if you were building up a horse to try and give him a head start as a 2-year-old, maybe anabolic steroids for yearlings would be a big thing. And to me, if you say we're not testing, and out of horses that are deemed out of training, we're not testing yearlings, it's like saying it's okay to do stuff in those two situations.
So you feel there's a tacit acceptance on the part of the authorities? That
Yes,
it's
I do.
acceptable in some cases?
So, Paul Batar, what do you make of that?
Well, David's views are to be respected. I mean, he's an incredibly well-credentialed guy when it comes to that sort of issue, and he is a genuine fan of the sport, so putting that in context. In terms of Britain, I don't think there's the specific issue or problem within the sport that he talks about, and certainly our benchmarking of our results in terms of positive tests compares it benchmarks quite well against other jurisdictions. So we have no reason to believe that there's, a proliferation or a widespread use of anabolic steroids in the sport, albeit we have had a couple of very high-profile cases in the last 18 months.
And Louis Romanet, what would you say? I take on board everything that you've already had to say, but Wal seems to be implying there that the authorities lack conviction.
I'm sorry,
No, Louis.
We can hear the question.
Yeah.
We couldn't hear the question.
He seems to be saying there that the authorities lack conviction, that you're not committed enough to putting an end to this.
Who is not committed enough? No, I think we are all committed. I think I want to be very straight. Every meeting we have, we raise the concern of the integrity of racing and of what should be done. Personally, my family has been involved in horse racing administration for more than 100 years. The first decision to disqualify horses for doping were taken in 1912. We had no testing at that time. It was just on a declaration of stable employees that recognized that they had given some product to the horses. Since that, we've been investing year after year. For example, in France, we started control of horses in training in 1995, nearly 20 years ago. We started to test horses out of competition in 2002. We will be starting this year in 2014 to test horses at stud when the rules of racing will have been modified with the agreement of the Ministry of Agriculture. We are spending 10 million euros in France for doping control. So how can you say it's not one of our priorities? It is, but as was said about sport, the problem is the labs are producing new medications on a permanent basis for humans, and every time you have something for humans, somebody is trying them for horses. So we are doing the best we can. We cannot guarantee anything at 100%, but the sensitivity we have, the quality of our technicians, when you're listening to people like Terry Wan in Hong Kong, like Yves Bonner in Paris, they know what they're talking about. And I think they are doing better than human labs. I don't want to criticize human labs, but with the money we invest in anti-doping research, I think we are at the highest level of control than the sports is. And I remember the first Group 1 winner that was tested positive for steroids was in France, many, many years ago, 5 years before Ben Johnson was positive. While looking at Ben Johnson, you were knowing he was on steroids for many years.
And Andrew Harding, from the point of view of the Asian Racing Federation, what would you say to that?
Look, I think it has to be recognised that when it comes to racing, the jurisdictions that are more integrated have an easier job of it. That's certainly true in economics, it's true in integrity. And that problem's even more compounded if you've got a federal system. So in Asia, we are reasonably fortunate in terms of the models that we have. And with those models, I do think we're ahead of the game. And I say that for this reason. If you look at the incidence of positive samples, there are overwhelmingly cases of legitimate therapeutics and the withdrawal time has been miscalculated or the contaminated feed. The incidence of you know, the bad drugs, the performance-enhancing drugs, is truly low. Now, Pericles might say, you test a lot, you don't find much, maybe you're not able to find it, maybe it's there. But I don't think that's true of racing, certainly not racing in Asia, and I say that for this reason, because of all of those things that he pointed to as the other strategies that you need to have in place, we have those. We have had those for some time. Louis pointed to France's record on out-of-competition testing. In Hong Kong and in Singapore, that's just a feature of the way the industry is structured. But in Australia, which is largely decentralised, we introduced out-of-competition testing 10 years ago. We're investing in the research that's necessary to stay ahead of the game. And take Australia as the example of a bit further. They're going a bit further again. They're saying, we're going to define the career of the racehorse from birth. And from birth to retirement, the horse has to be traceable. It has to be available for testing. So I would say to the proposition that David Walsh puts, that in the case of racing, certainly racing in Asia, it's not true. And I think it's demonstrable that we do have the courage of our convictions.
And Jim, what would you say as it applies to the United States?
Well, as Andrew said, there's some jurisdictions around the world that enjoy a federal system, a centralized authority. In the United States, we don't have such a thing. We have 38 different states that regulate racing in a separate basis. In cases like recently the poor publicity that came out from the Asmussen tapes, that only highlighted that we have inconsistencies in our rules and our standards in our labs throughout the United States, and that further galvanizes our spirit to improve our standing in the United States. We've done so in a number of ways through the Jockey Club. Back in 2011, we published the standard, which is called the Reformed Racing Medication Rules, which has become our platform for advocacy, pointing towards the best penalties, the best rules, the best lab standards, and finally, improved investigations of violations.
Do you concede, though, with the Asmussen case, it took animal rights campaigners to effectively set a trap and to catch a trainer and to expose cheating in some cases, but also cruelty? Do you accept that it took that? And how damaging will that be?
Well, I won't pass judgment on what we saw, other than that we certainly all witnessed a lot of coarse language and some potential for violations, but we'll leave that to the authorities and in the investigations. Clearly, our game is a game that requires the consumer confidence and trust that we're taking care of the horse in the best way that we can. The research that we did back in 2011 put at the very top of the priorities for the sustainability of the sport is the welfare of the horse. So videos like that certainly affect the perception of the sport, and while we think that that was an anomaly, we take it very seriously.
And what are the prospects of federal legislation dealing with this?
That's a tough question. Someone told me the last Congress, the last U.S. Congress, of all the bills that were introduced during that session, only 3% passed. So having a federal bill is passed and made into law. It's not an easy process to begin with in the United States. But I see more and more stakeholders in the industry interested in a federal solution. Clearly, in the United States, horse racing, by the virtue of it being simulcasting, it is an interstate business. So there is some thought within our industry that federal legislation would make the most sense. The Jockey Club will support any measure that will see those uniform rules applied, the right penalties and the right standards for labs. We've been working with those 38 states, and if time should come for us to work with federal authorities, we'd be pleased to do so.
And Pericles, are you in a position to say, compare one sport to another in terms of how they do respond to this issue? It's been said that racing feels as if they're out in front of the others. Are you able to make judgments on that?
Well, unfortunately, I cannot really make a judgment on it, But I have to say, almost every federation claims that they are pretty much ahead of all the other ones in fighting doping. I think that's almost in the nature of the situation. But to be honest, I could imagine that race horsing is indeed ahead in terms of a very important issue, which is a conflict of interests, for example. In humans, we have the problem that politics was involved for a very long time. So we even had the Eastern German political situation with pressure on athletes to dope. And it was even applied to them without them knowing. And in Western Germany, it was a very high indirect pressure, so they had to do it in a way. I don't think that such systematic issues matter here, but it's certainly the money involved. And good news is money doesn't really matter because it's all about glory. We know from certain sports that where, like rowing, where athletes merely are able to live on what they get from the sports, but nevertheless doping is an issue. So what I think is horse racing should keep a skepticism about the efficacy of the anti-doping system. That's very important. And to have a very close look at the data that are available and to see whether out-of-competition testing really makes a difference is one option. Another option would be to compare the efficacy of different anti-doping federations, different national approaches. I very much like the approach that has been presented today from, I think it was Korea, is it correct? The Korean Federation. And I think then take the best of all of it. And I really think that most of the people like to see integrity in sports and that those guys involved in trying to deal with it do their best job. But like in the industry, we have to decide where the money needs to go to. What is the most effective way to keep the integrity in horse racing?
Lance Armstrong cheated for a very long time. Why did it take so long to catch him?
Well, they caught him because of an extraordinary effort, which wouldn't have been made in any other athlete on the world, on the planet, most likely. So I wouldn't think that they would have ever catched him if it wasn't Lance Armstrong. And it wasn't because of testing. It was because of investigations. And why did it take such a long time? Well, you only need a second or third level doctor, maybe a major of business administration like in Austria. That was the guy who doped all the Austrian athletes for a longer period of time without them being detected, is all you need. You don't need a specialist. So Fuentes is a gynecologist, and he has been effectively doping a lot of elite athletes over several years. And unfortunately, we have to keep in mind, even though attempts like the ones taken by Mr. Bonaire are exceptional and very, very profound work has been done in a laboratory, we need to be critical about what we can achieve by just putting our attempts into the laboratory. And we also, there we have to decide what is the right ratio of funding science versus funding testing itself.
Now, Andrew?
I think it's a relevant point of distinction between racing and other sports, for example, cycling, that because we are gambling related, have been since our inception, we are and always have been hyper conscious about integrity. And that's led us to build networks and frameworks to ensure integrity, including intelligence, the use of intelligence. I mean, the dogs were barking for a very long time that there was something wrong with Lance Armstrong. And if you had that repeated in racing, then you'd be able to call upon all of that framework that's in place in terms of our stewards, working with our laboratories and our integrity officers. And I think I'm not saying that we necessarily would have succeeded where they failed, but I think we are much better geared for success.
Now, I'm conscious that we're almost out of time, and I think, as I understand it, the buses leave for the social event in about half an hour, which doesn't give people a lot of time. But is there a contribution that somebody wants to make by way of summary based on the discussions we've had? I don't want to leave anybody frustrated that they haven't had an opportunity to make a point. Anybody?
I'm fine.
All happy? Now, Mr. Chairman, I know that you would like to draw attention to a conference, a very important conference related to this later on this year in Mauritius.
Oh, okay. Thank you so much for taking this opportunity. I just want to remind the racing authorities, people who can make decisions. Practically, there will be a conference, international conference called ICRAB. It's a conference for racing analysts and veterinarians. It will take place in Mauritius this September. It's a place where analysts and veterinarians can acquire update of doping agents, testing methods, or like injury prevention, welfare issues, what's necessary for the racing authorities. So for the racing authorities, please send vets and chemists to that conference, and please fund them so that they could make a contribution. And that's what I want to remind. And can I have another comment to Korea? I just want to congratulate the KRA for taking a big step, because this is an Asian conference. It's very important for like small Asian countries or developing countries to take an international step. So I understand even Korea has just adopted one single fluniximab drug to adopt an Asian screening limit, but I know that it was a very big step, so I'd like to congratulate that, and we would welcome any other countries who want to participate in international racing, because in the ARF website and in the IFHA website, there's a screening limit. It's very simply stated, so please refer to that as well. Thank you.
Well, thank you for your attendance today. Enjoy the night, and we'll see you tomorrow. Thank you.
Koji, very much. Now we'd like to open to any questions that you might have of our remaining guests here today. Some very interesting presentations. I might just pose a question of my own to you, Andrew. You've worked on some remarkable sporting projects around the world. Congratulations. What's been the most fulfilling racing-related project that you've worked on from an environmental sustainability perspective?
Fulfilling racing-related.
I
think, as I was saying during the presentation, anything that helps to increase the use of the race course, you know, in an environment where you do have declining numbers of spectators and declining revenue streams, that if you can turn that around somehow, if you can do something to the design of the race course to turn that around somehow, you're helping head things in the right direction. I think from that point of view, Randwick, with the focus on the new entry area, so you're setting up a new entrance and better areas where the festivals can take place. I think, you know, they're not necessarily funky designs, they're just creating places where people can gather and enjoy themselves. So Randwick and Sydney, sorry.
Okay, very good. Any questions? Yes. We'll bring a microphone to you first.
It's questions for Mr. Koji-san.
Oh.
Yes. I'm very impressed with your recycle rate of 100%, and you actually use some of the bottles and create it into materials to make it into uniforms for the staff. Being Hong Kong is a very small city, how do you achieve when you plan all these facilities? Is it in-house within the race course, or is it a facilities that was planned as a separate locations?
Oh. Okay.
He does not understand. We might just get you to come up and take a seat. Take a seat.
Do you want to sit here?
it's okay.
別な場所で契約したところで外部の外部の契約したリサイクルプラントで、オーダーして作ってもらってるっていう形ですから、中でプラントを持っているわけではない。
Actually, we do not have the recycling plants within the JRA. It's what we entrust the recycling to the outside factory.
Regarding the number curve, after I understand that you are using the recycled plastic to produce the number curve. So after using this number curve, will you reuse it or you just recycle it again?
Yes. 全部は使えてないかもわかんないけれども、まあ部分一部はリサイクルに回せる、まあ要するにきれいなものはリサイクルに回せるけれども、レースを使ったものについてはあれはリサイクルできないものが多い。
Actually, the question I understand is about the number cloth, or whether you, after use, you recycle it, whether you recycle it or not. And actually, many of the number cloths, well, after the races, it's not suitable for recycling. So many of them must be not recycled. But we usually, the clean ones, we send them to the recycling plants too. And also we do try to get it to the fan present. When all the race goers, they like to have the number cloth, and we try to, after the races, we try to put it up on the rooftops, and we actually dry them up afterwards, and then we give it away to the fans during the various events at the race courses.
Yeah. Interesting question and a very interesting answer there.
Okay.
Question over here. Paco.
Question regarding solar panel installation around trackside to the Japanese delegate. When during the installation or subsequent commissioning or uses, do you face a lot of complaint from riders or trainer regarding the noise of having rain heated on the solar panel, the glare or reflection on the solar panel, or the temperature in the surround area being heated up because of the structure there? You get my questions?
So, sorry, we weren't able to get the translation for the questions in Japanese. So if you could just repeat the question for me.
That's okay, I can speak slowly.
Yeah.
So when you install the solar panel by the track side, along the track areas, so when it's put into use, do you have a lot of complaints from trainers or riders? Because you might have rain hitting heavily on the panel, having a lot of noise, or you have a glare or reflection affecting horses, making them shine or spooky, or whether you will heat up the temperature once you have the structure there.
競馬場には導入していないので、実際に苦情はないです。競馬場はルーフトップで、インナートラックについてはホースレーシングスクールだけなので、実際のレースでは馬場内には置いていないという。
Actually, we only install the solar system on the rooftop of the race courses only, and that's why it doesn't really affect the riders and the trainers and the noise and everything. It's only installed at the rooftop. And the thing is, we have it at the horse racing school. This is installed in the inner side, but this is it's not directly related to the racing itself. It is our school to educate the jockeys, so there's no complaints or anything about that.
Any further questions before we conclude? I think that's covered it. Thank you very much to our speakers today, and thank you for your attendance. Enjoy your evening.